Welcome to We Chat Divorce. Today, Catherine and I welcome Cary Jacobson, the founder and CEO of Jacobson Family Law, where she is a best interest attorney, a child advocate attorney, and certified mediator. Welcome, Cary.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Our episode today is all about how prenuptial agreements can keep the drama out of the divorce process. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about ways a prenup agreement can reduce conflicts during divorce, steps couples should take before drafting a prenuptial agreement, and how to tailor a prenuptial agreement to meet the needs of each couple. But first, let's meet Cary. Cary has been practicing law for over a decade, having successfully represented clients in all facets of family law proceedings in Maryland. She works with clients by listening to their concerns and helping them identify their goals and interests for the divorce process, as well as the future beyond it. Cary is skilled in a variety of dispute resolution options and helps identify what divorce process is best for her clients' need. So, again, Cary, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Cary, we like to start our conversations with our podcast guests by asking you to share a little bit of your story and how you came to your career path in the family law industry.
Sure. So, um, I have known since I was probably in late elementary, early middle school that I wanted to be an attorney. My mom actually started working for an attorney at that point in time as a legal secretary, and that just interested me. However, she worked for a divorce attorney, and I was like, that seems like the most boring thing ever. I don't know why would anybody want to do that. So my intention had been to go to law school, become a prosecutor, and then eventually make my way onto the bench. Um, However, my parents are also divorced, and I ended up taking sociology classes in college. And so the family law world really resonated to me once I made it to law school. And I no longer really wanted to take that criminal path, though I think a lot of divorce attorneys or attorneys would say criminal clients are actually easier in a lot of ways than
Yeah.
family law clients.
Yeah.
So and I've actually been a mediator since I was in high school. So it's just all kind of been combined with one another.
That's awesome. The gift of committing your practice to families is really commendable. And you know, a lot of family law attorneys, as we all know, are kind of assigned to that in their firm for a variety of reasons. So, to meet you where this is your chosen path really speaks volumes.
Well, I'm curious if you don't mind me asking. I give your mom a lot of kudos here for being an inspiration for you or being just a role model. But even her working in a law firm, was their divorce process something that encouraged you even more that you wanted to help people do it better or do it different, or that did that have any fuel behind your desire?
Probably a little bit. I will say that as divorces go, now that have been in this field for so long, theirs was not as contentious as many of them. They weren't in, litigation for extended periods of time and that sort of thing. However, there were periods of time where, you know, what they were not as amicable as they could have otherwise been.
Mhm.
And so seeing how litigation can really tear families apart and the toxic environment it can produce for kids is really the reason I chose to focus our firm on the alternative dispute resolution.
That's great. And that, I always say to the clients that come to MDS, working with our team members is really the advocacy for the children of divorce, right? You get these
Absolutely.
families to do it just a little bit better than the
Yeah,
archaic system that's set up right now. Gosh, we're really doing a good job for a million people out there getting divorced every year.
absolutely. Yeah, and the impact is so long lasting, right? So
Mm.
it really is. Um, how can we focus on the kids and make that a better solution for them.
Good for you. Good for you.
Yeah. Thanks for thanks for sharing that little backstory for us. It's I think our listeners will benefit and certainly we benefit. So we're talking today about prenuptial agreements. And typically when that topic comes up, people kind of bristle and say, "Oh, that just means we're just setting ourselves up to get divorced." We vehemently say not so.
Right.
What's your perspective on that?
I think, really there are those myths out there about prenuptial agreements, that they're really only for people who have a lot of assets, that they're unromantic, or because you distrust the other, person. And I'm trying to change the narrative around prenuptial agreements because we all see that one of the most common reasons why people divorce is around finances because they don't have conversations about them. And the way that I really see prenuptial agreements is opening up those lines of communication to talk about it at the outset. So, if nothing else, everybody's on the same page with what they're going to do.
What's your take on I'm hearing a lot of buzz, it's a wedding world around here now, right? All of our friends' kids are getting married. And
Right.
that is the dinner conversation when we go out, especially if I'm sitting there, they want to ask me my opinion, financially speaking, about a prenup. What is your, they're afraid of like my estate going to my son-in-law, right?
Yep.
That's what they're concerned about.
Yep.
And they struggle with making their children get prenups.
Yeah. So there are ways to protect inheritance from the marital distribution, but you have to be very conscious of it, and do it the right way if you don't have that prenup, right? So as long as you take that money and you put it in that special designated account, what I'm sure you all have seen and what I have seen is just the not knowing. And then you put that marital bonus in the same account, and now the whole thing is commingled. And so that's really the fear of not having the prenup. So if someone's going to be very diligent and protect those assets, they can do it, but you have to be really mindful of it.
So is a prenup a better way to go in those particular types of situations? And, we can talk about globally all of the situations, but in what Catherine's specifically talking about, is a prenup a better way to go?
It really is seeking clarity, right? So usually in a prenup, you're going to specify that the inheritance is going to be a separate asset. And typically, there's some language in there that says that even if it does happen to go into an account, that it's going to maintain its separate or non-marital status.
Well,
So
that's a good
there is
point.
that extra layer of protection, that's usually bound in the prenup that's not necessarily in that you have otherwise.
That's a really good that's a very good point. I want to ask you this. So we have a lot of clients coming through the process, they're getting prepared and they have a prenup.
Mhm.
And it's always, why we're gathering the documentation to support the information in the prenup and what's not in there. We say to them, you need your attorney consult to see how legit is the prenup. And it always amazes me and probably you, Karen, as well, the difference of opinions between attorneys. Oh yeah, we could fight this one. Oh no, we can't fight this one. Oh no, you did this one in that state, so now you're in this state. Like, how do you know whether your prenup is really has grounds to stand on? Because we just come from a financial point of view, and then we want to consider it. But we hear just so many different versions of how do you tell if your prenup will actually hold up in divorce?
It really will depend on the jurisdiction, but it's a contract, right? And if both parties had an opportunity to review that contract with an attorney, if they chose to do so, then in most situations, it's probably going to be valid. Now, if they were given the contract on the eve of the marriage, then you have a different situation, right? Were you under duress when you signed it? Or had you been looking at this thing and talking about it for months ahead of time?
Mhm.
right? So just because you didn't choose to get an attorney at the time that you were negotiating it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be invalid. But, I have seen the scenario of the week of, oh, by the way, I want you to sign this. And that's really going to be challenging.
So the date on that as compared to the date of your marriage would then be important, right?
That
Yeah.
that is absolutely one of the things that we're looking for. Yeah.
Mm, yeah.
So, from that base, Carrie, what are the fundamental requirements of a prenuptial agreement?
Most importantly is the financial disclosure. So did both people disclose all of the assets that they had at that time? Because if you're asking the other person to waive their interest in something, they need to know what it is that they're waiving their interest in. I've had scenarios where a potential client was like, well, do I have to disclose everything? Yes, we have to disclose everything, right? So you want to make sure that everything is listed. We generally list, everything from bank accounts, retirement accounts, houses, cars, and even income at that point in time, because that can also be a large disparity.
Mm.
Generally, they need to be witnessed by at least one, if not two other people. I think it may depend on the state whether or not it needs to be notarized. I commonly require them to be notarized just to make sure that that person is the person that they say that they are signing. Um, and then there's a little um, I've seen scenarios where if they do have like a 401k already, or I'm in Maryland, so we see a lot of thrift savings plans. Um, a requirement to sign again after the marriage has taken place, because I think the theory is you can't waive your interest in something that you don't yet have an interest in. So, in order to waive your interest in those retirement accounts, to also sign like a one pager right after the fact.
Oh, wow. What if they don't?
I've not seen it become an issue, but it's an extra layer of protection.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
never heard that before. What about those prenups that, when we're looking at it, and again, we come from a financial lens, so it'll say the assets or it'll just have a brief thing and it'll mention an exhibit, but there is no exhibit. So we can't compare what they have now to what was supposed to be in an exhibit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it really should have the exhibit on it because that's going to be the full financial disclosure. And so, it should be there somewhere. And
So
if
if you were an attorney and you received that with no exhibit, would you be stop, like, wait, somebody has to produce this exhibit to
I
me?
would say so, yeah, because
Yeah.
that's the financial disclosure. If that wasn't acknowledged, then what are they waiving, or what's included in that prenup?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Carrie, when they disclose their assets and debts at the time of the agreement, is it also required that they produce documentation to support that disclosure, or is it taken at face value?
It's generally taken at face value.
Okay.
So we have a few situations where we see prenups with clients who had real estate, but then since that date of marriage, that real estate has been sold and another property has been purchased
Hmm.
with that same money.
Hmm.
So can the person who listed the original property, can they back it out even though it's been sold and purchased? Like if it was 200,000 and now you sold it and you bought one that's worth 400, are they allowed to back out the 400 that was mentioned in a prenup that no longer exists?
It very possible depending on what the language is in the agreement, because oftentimes what I see is that the language will say if that separate property then goes on to have further gains and is continued to be traced, then that's going to continue to be a separate asset.
Mm.
Yeah.
Oh,
Now,
that's
if
interesting.
oftentimes there's like a clause that says that if it becomes a joint property, right? Like if they move that, so if they sold that house, they put those proceeds into a joint bank account. That joint bank account is then a marital asset. Then it's a question of whether or not it was commingled. But again, it would depend on the language. It may carve it out as being continued to be separate property.
Mm.
That's very interesting. Carrie, what about the term sunset clause?
I don't typically come around those too often. Um,
Okay. We hear them in the South a lot.
hmm, I'm trying to remember if I've ever had a scenario where there's a sunset clause. So what I have seen is that every once in a while there may be an agreement that says if we're married more than X number of years, then this is what's going to happen, right? And if we're
Mhm.
married less than that, then it's going to be this division, whether it's a division of assets or even potentially an alimony clause. I'm not sure if that's the same thing that you're
Yeah.
referring to. Okay,
Yeah,
I
it is.
haven't heard
Yeah.
the term before.
Yeah. I think it's probably, from my experience, more prevalent in the South than it is in the North or Northeast.
Yeah.
All right. So we've talked about, oh, go ahead, Catherine.
I was just going to say, in your practice, how many prenups do you have coming through? Has it increased a lot over the last couple of years?
It has increased, and I will actually say what we see probably the largest increase because they weren't very common before are postnuptial
Oh,
agreements.
I wanted to touch on that, but I didn't know if we were allowed to today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I am seeing an increase in postnuptial agreements from people who are generally happily married. It's just most commonly they're coming into play if one or both of the spouses start businesses during
Mhm.
the marriage and they
Mhm.
want to protect that business interest. So that's where we've seen an uptick in that activity.
I had an assessment call yesterday and they've been married 30 years. She's 60, he's 63. They have a farming industry, right? A farming business. And she doesn't want necessarily the business and he doesn't want her to have it, but she wants income for the rest of her life, right? Or she would take it in the form of income, I should say. And she doesn't even know if she wants to divorce. She's thinking about it. And so, I did say that to her. At my divorce solution, sometimes your solution is not to get a divorce. Maybe you need a post up and you'll go to an attorney with your portrait and say, here's what it is, and here's the financial life I want to live,
Right.
although different than him. So you can live two different financial lives and stay married with a post nup. And I think
Absolutely.
it's a great solution for a lot of people with businesses like that.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's there as protection as well because in the event in the future either of them do proceed with a divorce, then they've already resolved what that's going to look like. Yeah.
Is there a provision in a postnup that if you stay married, you just want this financial arrangement, and then one of the parties pass away, you still have the marital right to that property? Or does a postnup kick in then?
So even if you do a postnup, similar to a prenup, it doesn't necessarily specify. I mean, it can if the parties agree, but it doesn't necessarily specify what's going to happen for the inheritance. A lot of times there's a waiver, but if you do an estate plan, um, in addition to that, then the estate plan is going to trump the postnup or prenup language. So, they could have their estate plan, whether it's a trust or a will, that specifies what's going to happen to those assets upon either of them passing away.
Okay, and that trumps a postnup.
Yep. Usually, the postnup will say, what the language we typically see is we waive our interest into inheritance, but that in no way prevents us from having an estate plan that says otherwise.
Mm,
Very
that's good to
interesting.
know. Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And, on that business topic, I think a lot of people don't realize this, but if there are businesses in existence, especially with third parties, sometimes those operating agreements or shareholders agreements would almost mandate a prenup because of the divorce provisions in the those agreements. Have you experienced a lot of that?
I haven't experienced it, but I definitely understand why that would be
Hmm.
because one of the biggest concerns when have a business is how is a divorce going to impact that? If that one stakeholder is now going through a divorce and they have to pay their spouse half of their interest in it, where is that going to come from?
Hmm.
And are there other assets that they're going to be able to pay that from, or are they going to have to somehow, is that going to impact their business interest? So yeah,
Yeah.
and see why that would be very important.
Yeah. Okay, so have a couple approaching marriage or a couple who's married and want to talk about a postnuptial agreement. How do we change the narrative? How do we have good conversations that don't negatively emotionally impact that relationship as historically established? Right, because we've all said having these types of conversations by default say, well, you don't trust me, right? You don't, yeah. So how do we change that narrative?
Think it's in the approach, right? It's not, I want to keep my assets and you're going to keep yours. It's more of a, I want us both to be protected in the event this happens. And it's not that we, you know, want to embark on a divorce, but the statistics are what they are. And it's really, I look at it as like an insurance policy. You don't want the terrible event to happen, but you have that protection in the event that it does.
Great
Um,
analogy.
yeah.
Hmm.
And
Mm,
so one thing that we have also seen a lot of is people coming to mediation to have that conversation.
mm,
So instead of both of them, quote unquote, lawyering up, having that conversation and mediation about what they envision it to look like. And that could be everything from how they may approach um, separating the debts, how they're going to pay for expenses throughout the marriage. Um, a lot of times people are waiting until later to get married, and so they already come into the marriage with a house or other assets. And so what's going to happen with that house if the non-owning spouse puts money into it? Capital improvements, what does that look like? So I think really having it as a conversation of not just a demand is really.
Carrie, that's what I love about the MDS portrait is because we do the exhibit, so to speak, right? And so we have all that disclosure and all the document. We get the documentation though on our end to verify because we have to verify the number. We're all, financial people need to verify numbers. So with that in place, it's really easy for them to then go to you and say, help us mediate through this, right? Then you could talk, then you have the data all there. And because we make it an exercise, not such an embarrassing moment for anyone, it's a safe space to share that information and we have no judgment there. Then our team can send that over to you to do a really good conversation. To get everyone on the same page to what their thought process is, which is really what in turn will change the dialogue.
Right. And it's just really, in my opinion, opening up those lines of communication because so many couples don't have that financial conversation. And they just kind of fall into what they fall into. And then, 10 years later, it's like, well, why have we been doing it this way? It's because they never talked about how to do it any other way, and have definitely different approaches to how they handle money. And so opening up the lines of communication at the outset so that they do get on the same page as to how they want to handle finances can even potentially prevent divorces in the first place.
Oh, I totally agree with you there because it is finances and kids.
Yep.
So does it matter if you're married in Maryland and then you get divorced in South Carolina? Do you have to update anything if you move to a different state?
You shouldn't, because it's a contract, it's valid. It's just when you move to that new state, that's going to be the law that applies.
oh, that's the
Okay.
governing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. That's
So
very
we all do
interesting.
contracts, with someone else in a different state, a different company, and the contract is in Delaware. So the Delaware law is going to apply, or whatever the case may be.
So if I'm getting married in South Carolina, but I just love you so much and I want you to do it for me, does it matter? Can I have it? Can I have a prenup done in Maryland? Or do you have to do it in the state in which you get married?
Yeah. So typically it is done not necessarily where you're getting married, but where you intend to continue to reside. And now it doesn't necessarily mean, 5 years later you decide to move to Arizona that it won't be valid. But if you're planning to go to Vegas to get married, but your residence is going to be South Carolina, then I would recommend that it be done in South Carolina.
Well, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And if you don't have if you're not going through mediation, it is most common that both parties would have their own attorneys to review the agreement. Usually it's the parties who are kind of making those negotiations, um, and really just kind of using the attorney to answer any legal questions along those lines.
We saw a terrible case of a really smart woman that came through, uh, marry someone and actually used his same attorney who drew up the agreement, and then they couldn't find the exhibit, and it was supposed to be. I felt horrible for her, and all the attorneys on her side were saying, "Well, it's legit." That's why I asked you that. One of
Yeah.
the reasons I asked that beginning question. You know who I'm talking about, Karen, right? That
Hmm.
was just a terrible. It was so sad to see, and the differential in assets and income are like this now, this many years later, and
And, frankly, she didn't have the wherewithal to hire an attorney to dig into the legitimacy of the agreement. And so nobody wanted to take the case because they were up against spouse who had, you know, assets
Hmm.
for three or four lawsuits.
and
So,
she just
yeah,
said she
it was a
loved him.
very unfortunate.
Yeah, remember, she
Yeah.
just loved him when they got married,
Yeah.
so she signed it.
So
Mhm.
it's, this all comes down to, what you're talking about, Carrie, preparation. People, if they just understand that preparation is really one of the most important steps to take. And even, in preparing for divorce, we even talk to our clients about, maybe it will be a post-nup, maybe it will be divorce, maybe it won't be anything. But
Right.
having this knowledge is invaluable. So if you're preparing to get married, having the knowledge and having those financial conversations just lends itself to, um, first of all, to your point, a really strong relationship, but also not really ever having to wonder about it again or, create distrust if something happens that you don't really understand. It really creates a good foundation, I believe. And I think that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what people don't necessarily understand, that is, if they don't have, this type of document that they have agreed upon as far as what's going to happen with the assets, the default is what your state law is, where you're living at the time of the divorce, right? And so it may be different than what you anticipated it being. And so it's also knowing what those laws are, because it the state, if you don't have your own prenup, the state has one for you in
Mm.
by way of the divorce laws.
Oh,
Yep.
that's profound.
Mhm. Yeah, and some are
Wow.
not so friendly, so yeah, yeah.
And quite expensive, right?
Like,
Yeah. Well, this has been an excellent conversation, Carrie. How can our listeners find you and learn more about you?
yes, so they can find us on our website, which is jacobsonfamilylaw.com. We're also on all the social media channels, including YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And so we try to get a lot of educational information out there for folks so that they know, what their options are.
So, this concludes our discussion on how prenuptial agreements can keep the drama out of the divorce process. Thank you so much for a fantastic conversation, Carrie.
Thank you so much for having me.